Good morning, friends. Today we will have the second lecture by Professor Stephen Crow from Rice University. He will talk about why ask why, retrieving reason in being time. I promise you will experience a new vision of Heidegger's early phenomenological thinking in this lecture. Please join me to welcome Professor Stephen Crow.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the wonderful discussion we had last night or yesterday morning. I'm looking forward to presenting another aspect of the project that I'm engaged in and have been for a number of years now. In our last meeting, I discussed commitment as a condition on all forms of normative binding or normative force. And today I want to show more precisely where commitment belongs in the project of being in time. And in so doing, I will introduce what I call Heidegger's normativity first account of practical reasons, and generally his critique of the rationalist tradition in philosophy. This is part of a larger project that really tries to do two things. First, to show that Heidegger's ontology is not irrationalist, as many commentators believe. And second, I want to deny the applicability of the central rationalist notion, the principle of sufficient reason, as it is found, for instance, in Hegel. I won't be doing that in any of our lectures, but that's part of the broader project. I will continue this project next week when we discuss the notion of second-person reasons in Stephen Darwall and Emmanuel Levinas. And I'd like to show how Heidegger's approach to conscience, which I will discuss today, solves the problem that confronts both Levinas and Darwall. But that's for next week. Today, I want to explore the place of reason in being in time. So I've titled my talk, Why Ask Why? Retrieving Reason in Being in Time. In late writings, Heidegger is fond of quoting Angelus Silesius, quote, "The rose knows no why. It blooms because it blooms," as an emblem of the existence untroubled by the principle of sufficient reason. Already in Being in Time, he had broken with the tradition by defining the entity which each of us is, Dasein, as care, Sorge, rather than as rational animal. Dasein is neutrally described as any entity for which, in its being, that very being is essentially an issue. A description that captures what matters in replacing reason by care. To be, in the case of Dasein, is to be concerned with what it means to be, not just now and then, but essentially. What becomes of reason in being in time? In the literature, most answers to this question focus on Heidegger's ongoing efforts to show that rational discourse, logos apophantikos, or assertion, is not fundamental. Thus, it might appear that he not only rejects the traditional definition of human being, but also refuses reason any essential role in the ontological account that replaces it. But I will argue that the care structure does not render reason a contingent and ultimately dispensable option for Dasein. It resituates reason as reason giving, something demanded of us by our being as care. Being in Time thus offers what I will call a normativity first approach to reason, in contrast to a reasons first approach to normativity. A reasons first approach, exemplified in what follows by Kant's transcendental philosophy, determines what norms are by the reasons we have for being bound by them. whereas a normativity first approach determines what reasons are by elucidating them as responses to a normative claim. The retrieval of reason in Being and Time requires consideration of two texts composed during the same period, On the Essence of Ground from 1928 and Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics from 1929. Fortunately, a comprehensive interpretation of either supplemental text is not necessary. Though Being and Time devotes no heading or subheading to the topic of reason, there is much discussion of knowledge and truth, which have tight connections with the traditional concepts of reason and rationality and provide touchstones for Heidegger's interpretation of Kant. Here we must be selective, but some consideration of what Heidegger calls ontological knowledge will highlight what he takes to be the phenomenological yield of Kant's critique of pure reason, a concept of pure, sensible reason as the ground of metaphysics. Since Heidegger claims that Kant's project corresponds in intention to that of Being and Time, such clarification will suggest where we should look to retrieve reason in the analytic of Dasein. So section 1, Heidegger's rejection of the neo-Kantian approaches to knowledge. Early on in Being and Time, and throughout, Heidegger identifies two elements of our knowledge of beings, or ontic knowledge, namely nous and logos, noein and legein. Heidegger resists translating either term as reason, but both enter into the traditional concept of reason. Logos is reason in the sense of giving an account of something, logon didonai, an answer to the question why, and so involves saying or asserting something about something. To adopt this sense of reason is to conceive truth as a property of judgments or propositions organized into a logical system of grounds and consequence governed by the principle of sufficient reason. This is essentially the position of Marburg neo-Kantianism, for instance, Hermann Cohen, Paul Natorp, and Ernst Cassirer, and it provides the foil for Heidegger's phenomenological reading of Kant. Reason in the sense of nous, which Heidegger usually translates as Vernehmen, perception, or Anschauung, intuition, in Being and Time, is quite different from logos. It is the immediate encounter with something, a kind of truth whose opposite is not falsity, but unreceptivity. One either does or does not see. In Aristotle, such seeing is reserved for immediate sense qualities, but also for the ultimate principles or archai or grounds of things, the categories. In the latter sense, noetic reason is the source of ontological rather than ontic knowledge. Ontological knowledge is not concerned with properties of beings and the relations between them, but with being, sein, that which constitutes beings as beings. The neo-Kantian epistemological program eliminates this sense of reason, ostensibly on the authority of Kant, for whom they suppose nous is the intellectual intuition ruled out by the first critique. In contrast, nous is central to Husserl's phenomenological project, whose principle of all principles subordinates logos to nous in a decisive way. Quote, each intuition affording something in an originary way is a legitimate source of knowledge, and no conceivable theory can make us stray from this principle because any theory can draw its truth only from originary givenness. Heidegger follows this phenomenological path in Being and Time. All talk, all assertion and judgment is measured by seeing, by exhibiting it directly and demonstrating it directly. As I suggested earlier, Heidegger sees his own fundamental ontology prefigured in Kant's project of laying the groundwork for metaphysics in the sense of metaphysica generalis. To lay the groundwork is not to engage in metaphysics directly, but to reflect on what makes it possible to do so. It is thus a transcendental project concerned not so much with objects as with the kind of knowledge we have of objects, insofar as this is possible a priori. While Kant likens transcendental ground laying to the method of the natural scientists, namely their realization that reason has insight only into what it produces itself according to its own design, and so constrains nature to answer its own questions, Kant's aim, says Heidegger, has nothing to do with a theory of knowledge or science. Instead, that aim is to show how comporting toward beings, or ontic knowledge, is made possible by the preliminary understanding of the constitution of being, ontological knowledge. If the preliminary understanding of the constitution of being is ontological knowledge, then laying the groundwork seeks the possibility of such knowledge in ontological transcendence, Heidegger's term for Kant's pure synthesis. A critical examination of pure synthesis is the main task of Heidegger's 1929 Kantbuch, and its elucidation requires phenomenological analysis of the Entwurf or projection, which constitutes beings as beings. We need not go into the details of Heidegger's exegesis of Kantian synthesis, however, because we are interested only in how ontological transcendence phenomenologically entails a retrieval of reason in being and time. In that regard, what matters is that for Heidegger, Kant's critique of pure reason, with its attendant rejection of metaphysica specialis, does not leave us with a neo-Kantian epistemology of science, but points toward a concept of pure sensible reason, human reason, finite reason, which embodies the relation between knowing and legging that is concealed in all logicism, neo-Kantian or otherwise, such as logical positivism. For Kant, knowing and legging appear as the two basic sources of the mind, sensibility and understanding. Sensibility, the receptivity of intuition, is that through which alone something is given, while understanding, the spontaneity of concepts, is that through which alone something can be thought. Kant conjectures that these sources may have a common but to us unknown root, a conjecture Heidegger develops into an interpretation of transcendental imagination as the unity of knowing and legging. This should have led Kant to a concept of pure sensible reason, but he shrank back from this insight and, in the second edition of the Critique, subordinated imagination to understanding so as to preserve the purity of reason, or logos, as a source of a priori knowledge. Fearing that the primacy of logic in metaphysics might fall, Kant abandoned the phenomenology of ontological transcendence initiated in the first edition, thereby straying from the path that leads to pure sensible reason. In Being and Time, however, the phenomenology of comportment, or Verhalten, shows us the way back to that path. So section 2, ontological transcendence and care. On Heidegger's reading, Kant acknowledges the priority of nous over logos when he claims that knowing is primarily intuitive, even while he recognizes that human intuiting is merely receptive and so demands that intuition's finitude and neediness be surpassed through understanding, thinking, and judging. This surpassing, or transcendence, unnecessary for the divine intuitus originarius, is taking the measure of things given in intuition, such that things become accessible in their being, that is, as what they are. Empirical science, Kant's paradigm of ontic transcendence or intentionality, takes this measure according to a plan of its own, that is, scientific theories. But the whole point of the critique is to show that such empirical accessibility has an a priori ground in pure intuition, that is, time as self-affection, and pure understanding, the I think, or apperception, which together, he says, make up the totality of pure sensible reason. Thus, all ontic transcendence, all intentional directedness toward beings, presupposes ontological transcendence, a projection that takes the measure of their being qua being. Before going into these matters, however, Heidegger considers Kant's account of the practical self and its relation to practical reason. And what he says proves to be decisive for a normativity first retrieval of reason in being and time. If in the first critique, the self of pure apperception or self-consciousness is a mere thought, not an intuition, things stand otherwise, according to Heidegger, in the critique of practical reason. There, self-consciousness is not a formal condition, but is intuited in the feeling of respect for the moral law. Moral feeling is the feeling of my existence as a practical being. And for Heidegger, its analysis illuminates the basic structure of the practical self's transcendence. How so? As a feeling, pate, hence form of receptivity, respect indicates susceptibility to the law. This means that respect is not a consequence of encountering the law, but rather the way in which the law first becomes accessible to us. Understood phenomenologically, this means that I cannot grasp a law, as opposed to a strange grammatical form, deontological ought, without first being receptive to the normative as such, to the distinction, for example, between normative force and coercion. A law becomes accessible as a law only if I'm able to feel myself bound by it. Such feeling is respect. In having a feeling for the normative, the respecting I becomes manifest to itself as an acting self. Reason, as free, gives to itself that for which the respect is respect. In thus subordinating myself to the law, I project myself to myself as the free creature which determines itself, that is, as autonomous. As Heidegger reads Kant, respect is the manner of the self's being responsible, authentic being itself. And this is the essence of the acting being, the essence of practical reason. Phenomenologically, then, the exercise of practical reason, for instance, in deliberation, does not define being responsible, but is grounded in the latter, an affective responsiveness to a normative claim which need not take the form of law. As Heidegger puts it, neither the law, or norm, nor the acting self can be apprehended objectively. They are manifest in a more original, unobjective, and unthematic way in duty and action, the acting being of the self in its unreflected form. At the end of my talk, I will return to the question of whether we can find such a phenomenological account of practical reason in being and time itself. But a brief look at the starting point of Heidegger's retrieval of Kant's inquiry into the transcendental subject of self introduces the central point. Heidegger begins by noting that Kant's question of how knowledge is possible bespeaks a kind of knowing that is not sure of itself, a reason that is essentially finite. And indeed, this finitude itself is at issue or in question in its being rational. This echoes the beginning of Being in Time, where the term Dasein picks out that entity who can raise the question of the meaning of being, an entity whose own being remains in question or at issue in all that it says and does. Thus, Heidegger highlights the need to direct phenomenological reflection away from the Kantian cognitive subject toward the subject as one who stands toward the world and so also toward itself in the practical form of questioning. In Being in Time, the entity that exists as care is described as thrown projection. Dasein finds itself thrown into the midst of beings, and these beings are manifest to it in various meaningful ways, thanks to its projection of their being. Thrown projection is thus the structural unity of the transcendence of Dasein, or ontological transcendence. But in contrast to Kant's project of rational grounding, Dasein's projection of the being of beings is never sure of itself. It cannot be ultimately grounded through an a priori construction or deduction, but is a project, a kind of philosophical empiricism in which ontological grounds are sought in response to a normative demand that precedes them, as I will explain in section 5. If that is so, then care, unlike Kant's pure apperception, is not a harmless categorical structure. It designates existence as a task, as zu sein, or having to be. Kant's philosophical project of Grundlegung, then, is itself one of Dasein's ways to be, namely being a philosopher, in which Dasein tries to make its ontological transcendence phenomenologically explicit to itself. In the Kant book, Heidegger notes, without explanation, that carrying out such a project, namely the working out of human finitude as the condition of possibility for the understanding of being, requires an existential interpretation of conscience, guilt, and death. As I will argue in section 4, the missing explanation is found in being and time, and reflection on these phenomena uncovers the pure sensible reason that Kant's critique of pure reason failed to find. Section 3, then, comportment as ontic transcendence. Our reading of being and time must limit itself to issues that bear directly on the question of whether an essential role for reason can be phenomenologically attested within the care structure. We noted earlier that being and time subordinates logos, the logic of assertion, to nous, the seeing in which being is made available in its difference from beings. But this does not mean that logos, as logon didonai, or giving an account, plays no essential role in the ontology of Dasein. Rather, reason as reason giving is grounded otherwise than in the tradition's conception of the human being as a rational animal, namely in the phenomenology of comportment. An adequate understanding of comportment's role, in turn, requires consideration of the relation between division 1 and division 2 of being and time. As we shall see, the derivative character of propositional truth, so heavily underscored in division 1, is not Heidegger's last word on reason as logos. Division 1 introduces comportment in the context of a phenomenological examination of how things show up for us meaningfully, as what they are, in our practical dealings with them. Such dealings have their own kind of sight, circumspection or Umsicht, thanks to which, for example, the hammer I use to drive a nail is there as a hammer rather than as an object with properties. Such sight does not require visually attending to the hammer. Indeed, the hammer shows itself as it truly is when it withdraws into its use. Nevertheless, circumspectively encountering the hammer as a hammer does require that it show up within a normatively constituted whole of relevance involving other equipment and the work being done, such that I can experience the hammer as appropriate or inappropriate, suitable or unsuitable in various ways. Being a hammer, what it means to be one, is thus always already understood more or less successfully in such practical dealings. But to understand in this sense is not simply to possess the concept hammer. Mere possession of the concept, such that I might be able to reliably recognize hammers, does not allow me to grasp this hammer with the circumspective sight in which it shows itself as it is. Meaning, in this sense, is not conceptual. It is either seen or not seen, as nous, and does not depend on my being able to give a true account, logos, of what it is to be a hammer. In being and time, comportment occupies the position that pure apperception or self-consciousness holds in Kant's project. In comportment, the self cites itself in a certain meaningful way, namely as trying to be something. In the language of being and time, comportment is acting for the sake of some possibility of my own being, where possibility is neither logical nor physical, but ontological, an ability to be, sein können. For instance, if I have the skills necessary to accomplish what carpenters are supposed to accomplish, then I'm able to be one. That is, I can use the tools available in such a way that they can show themselves in the normative relations that determine their fittingness for the task. Lacking such skills, I cannot be sensitive to when things are going well or badly. And so what a hammer is unavailable to me. But even if I have such skills, they will avail me nothing unless I act for the sake of being a carpenter, understand myself as a carpenter. Such understanding is an instance of what Heidegger calls Dasein's pre-ontological understanding of its own being. Acting for the sake of being something is what he calls ontic transcendence, or what I'm calling here practical identity. And it takes many forms: trades and professions, social roles, both explicitly codified, like being a senator, but also tacitly normed, like being a mentor, or a hipster, or a celebrity. Personal relations, such as parent and friend, and so on. How these are understood will vary from time and place, and the customary and legal norms pertaining to them will be familiar, publicly available at such times and in such places. But neither knowing what a teacher or father is supposed to do around here, nor being institutionally authorized to do it, is enough to constitute one as a teacher or father. Dasein does not have its practical identity as a property. It has this identity only in trying to be it. And in such trying, what it means to be what I'm trying to be is always at issue. Thus, we might say that in place of Kantian apperception, the I think, which must be able to accompany all my representations, Heideggerian self-consciousness is an I project that in fact does accompany my acting for the sake of being something, though mostly without becoming a theme in its own right. Such self-understanding is involved in comporting myself for the sake of any practical identity. For instance, my understanding of what a teacher is, or what it means to be a teacher, in my acting for the sake of being one. As previously mentioned, such meaning is initially understood in a public or average way based on the norms that hold in my time and place. But in trying to be a teacher, I can challenge those norms as inappropriate, as not fitting for what a teacher should be. In this sense, my self-understanding is always at issue in comportment and necessarily involves caring about living up to the norms of whatever I am trying to be. It is a practical matter whose success or failure is not measured by some fixed end that I might bring about. Rather, success or failure is measured at every moment in which I'm acting for the sake of being something. An aspect of the normativity first character of Heidegger's phenomenological analysis shows itself here. I am responsible for the norms of teaching, not in the sense that I invent them, but in the sense that in allowing a norm to exert normative force on my behavior, in binding myself to it, I am also committed to what it entails about the normative relations among beings, the paraphernalia of teaching here and now, the whole of relevance disclosed by the comportment of teaching. In short, my success in being a teacher cannot be measured if I am indifferent to how things should be in the matter of teaching. Let us consider this point a bit further. How does comportment enable the kind of sight, Umsicht, nous, that pervades our practical dealings with things? In Heidegger's terms, acting for the sake of being a teacher, or caring about what teaching means, discloses the world of teaching, the totality of significance normatively involved in what it means to be a teacher. Such world disclosure allows things to show up as useful or useless, serviceable or unserviceable for the purposes of what teachers do with them. The point is not that I'm originally confronted with a collection of mere objects, which I then throw a signification over. Rather, the point is that comportment or ontic transcendence is self-understanding in the world, and so also an understanding of the being of things that show up in the world. Thus, the kind of nous or Umsicht that allows us to see or be sensible of the hammer's normatively constituted availability, significance, is grounded in a kind of nous in which I cite myself, am available to myself in terms of the norms pertaining to my current practical identity. For Heidegger, such sight is not an infallible intuition. Like everything else about Dasein, it is at issue in existing. Thus, this finitude of self-understanding might seem incompatible with the idea that nous is an all or nothing affair, where one either sees or does not see. Addressing this worry requires deeper examination of the phenomenological relation between noetic self-citing in comportment and care, Dasein's being an issue for itself. So section 4, comportment as ontological transcendence. That relation is clarified in division 2, where the significance of Heidegger's brief allusion to the phenomena of anxiety, death, and conscience in Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics is fleshed out. For Heidegger, these are not independent variables, but belong to a single distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed to itself, that is, understands itself. And this way to be has both personal, existentiel, and methodological import. Its personal import lies in being the ground of my ability to recognize within every comportment, all ontic transcendence, a normative distinction between acting resolutely or irresolutely, authentically or inauthentically. Its methodological import for the transcendental project of Grundlegung lies in being the phenomenological evidence for ontological transcendence. The latter, following the parallel with Kant, is a pure or a priori ability to be that grounds empirical or ontic transcendence. The structure of ontological transcendence becomes phenomenologically evident in the breakdown of all our everyday comportments. Heidegger describes Dasein as throne projection. Thrownness, Geworfenheit, finding oneself in the midst of beings as a whole, is originally disclosed in mood or affect, Befindlichkeit. And for Heidegger, Angst is the affective character that belongs to breakdown. In Angst, the world can offer nothing more, and neither can the being with of others. That is to say, nothing matters because everyday normative claims no longer have an affective grip on me. All ontic comportment requires that I care about what it means to be what I'm trying to be. That is, it requires some level of commitment or bindung, but angst is an affective condition that undermines all such care or commitment. And because the meaningful availability of beings depends on my trying to be something, angst undermines the whole of relevance such that the world has the character of completely lacking significance. However, because projection of an ability to be, that is, trying to be something, is essential to the ontological constitution of Dasein as throne project, it seems that angst involves a paradox. If I cannot comport myself toward any practical identity, as what do I understand myself in the breakdown of all my commitments? Heidegger answers this paradox with another. When all my abilities to be, teacher, father, citizen, are affectively disabled, I understand myself as disability to be, nicht mehr da sein können. This would make no sense if Dasein were a thing with properties, but as a being whose being is always at issue, angst introduces me to the finitude of the practical identities for the sake of which I act. Thus, the self-understanding that belongs to the phenomenon of breakdown is what Heidegger calls death, distinguishing this from all forms of the ending of a life. Death is a way to be for Dasein, one in which I understand myself as solus ipse, I myself, without further qualification. All comportment, then, is being towards death, finite projection of what I'm trying to be. This means that what is at issue in any comportment includes what it means to be a self, full stop. The methodological role of Angst lies in bringing Dasein to this noetic grasp of its own being. To be a self is to stand suspended between particular ontic commitments, abilities to be, and their possible collapse in such a way that I can either embrace the finitude of these commitments transparently, Durchsicht, Heidegger's word for noetic grasp of selfhood as such, or flee that finitude by treating my possibilities as properties, thereby concealing what is phenomenologically evident in the breakdown of ontic comportments. If this may suffice for now to suggest how death contributes to elucidating the structure of ontological transcendence, a question remains. On Heidegger's view, the intelligibility that is at issue in all comportment or ontic transcendence is articulated in discourse, Rede. If this is true for ontological transcendence as well, however, we seem to be faced with another paradox. Discursive articulation, the way I talk about what I'm doing, normally depends on the world opened up by one's commitment to a practical identity and is generally a function of the public character of such identities. But if all such worlds have collapsed in Angst, it would appear that there is nothing to articulate. Heidegger addresses this paradox, as he did the previous one, by focusing on the mode of discourse in question, which he calls the call of conscience, rather than on its supposed paradoxicality. Conscience articulates the self-understanding achieved in death as disability to be. As the mode of discourse that speaks in the experience of breakdown, the call must have a character in every way opposite from that of engaged discursive practice. That is, it must give voice to how Dasein understands itself without the mediation of its practical identities. So the call of conscience asserts nothing, provides no information, but is instead has the character of a summons, Aufruf, that is second person address, like Fichte's Aufforderung. Further, it is silent while losing nothing of its perceptibility, Vernehmbarkeit, hearing as noetic sensibility. Finally, what it communicates is unequivocal, that is, beyond the reach of the pervasive ambiguity in everyday discourse. The call passes over what Dasein understands itself as, its practical identities, and what it counts for, can do, or concerns itself with in being with one another publicly. Nevertheless, he says, it reaches the self unequivocally and unmistakably. Despite these negative characterizations, hearing the call does give us something to understand about the self so reached. Dasein, according to Heidegger, understands itself as guilty, schuldig. What is this supposed to mean? Because the call addresses the self, the I am, without reference to any practical identity, being guilty cannot refer to anything I have done, as in guilty conscience. And in articulating the self as disability to be, the call is prior to the morally good and morally evil, making no reference to any law or ought. It neither warns nor reproves, but articulates the meaning of ontological transcendence, the phenomenological ground of ontic comportments. It is thus a logos that is also nous, pure sensible reason. In Being and Time, Heidegger's term for ontological transcendence, or the guilty heard in the call, is responsibility, Verantwortlichkeit. But we must attend closely to the second person character of this term. Ontological transcendence is answerability, the ability to answer to the call, which, as a summons, gives me to understand what is at issue in being self at all. For Heidegger, to be a self just is to be able to respond to the call, a response that is itself beholden to a measure, norm at issue in it, authenticity, or Eigentlichkeit, self-owning. Any comportment that issues from the call will thus involve the noetic sighting of selfhood as such, falling somewhere between the transparent or durchsichtig, noetic attestation of my responsibility and the listening away from that responsibility, wherein I attempt to render myself unreceptive to hearing the call. The phenomenological basis for retrieving reason in being and time is found in this notion of responsibility as answerability, where reason is not a constitutive feature of care, but is no less necessary for that. If the possibility of breakdown shows that Dasein can be without being anything, any practical identity, it also shows that Dasein, a self, cannot be anything without being answerable for what it does and says. Final section, section 5, retrieving reason in being and time. Let us admit that in Heidegger's discussion of the call of conscience, he makes no reference to reasons or reason giving. Nevertheless, I can find no way to make sense of Heidegger's description of what being guilty means if it is not the articulation of Dasein's responsibility for reasons, phenomenologically implied in care as ontological transcendence. I will try to defend this claim by juxtaposing a key passage in Being and Time's phenomenology of conscience with the account of reason found in On the Essence of Ground. Starting with thrownness, Heidegger emphasizes that Dasein always finds itself in the midst of beings over which it has no power. I can, of course, manipulate beings in various ways, just as I can resist my inclinations, motivations, and other psychological givens, but I cannot change the starting points, as it were, of such manipulations and resistance. I am delivered over, überantwortet, to them, not as something that has nothing to do with me, but as something I am, the facticity that belongs to the structure of care. Heidegger calls this the thrown ground, Grund, whose weight is disclosed as a burden, that is, as mattering in mood, or by mood. Right? On the Essence of Ground, this is the first form that grounding takes, taking up a basis, or we call it Bodennehmen. Dasein finds itself absorbed in beings as a whole, already attuned by them such that they affectively matter in one way or another. In Angst, this attunement is such that beings do not matter at all, but this is still a way of taking up a basis within beings as a whole. Thrownness, however, is what it is only together with Dasein's projecting itself onto possibilities into which it's been thrown. That is, taking up the various practical identities that are current in my time and place. On the Essence of Ground, this is the second form that grounding takes, grounding as establishing. The projection of the for the sake of is freely letting the world prevail. That is, it discloses the world of a particular practical identity. In the context of Being and Time's phenomenology of breakdown, however, the only for the sake of that remains is death, projection onto the disability to be any particular identity, the noetic grasp of the ability to be a self as such. Such self-understanding is a ground because it belongs to all comportment as the freedom thanks to which Dasein can obligate itself, bind itself to a practical identity. In Heidegger's phenomenology of conscience, he describes this by saying that even though the self can never get its thrownness into its power, as existing, that is, as projection, it must take over being a ground, bind itself to a practical identity. To be its own thrown ground is that ability to be, which is the issue for care, not just now and then, but essentially. So what does taking over being a ground mean here? If what is understood in the call of conscience, being guilty, is that Dasein must take over being a ground, this is not simply a descriptive fact about Dasein. Rather, in breakdown, Dasein is positioned second personally as the addressee of a summons or command. You must take over being a ground. Any response to this command, any taking over, will be a projection on possibilities, the exercise of a particular norm-sensitive ability to be at which I can succeed or fail. In this way, Dasein makes possible for itself its factical existence. Obviously, this does not mean that Dasein creates its facticity. It means that in taking over being a ground, I possibilize the factic grounds that ground me as thrown. Because it is thrown, taking over being a ground is finite, both in the sense that my facticity is jeweilig, a particular time and place where not every way to be is available, and in the sense that I can only project one possibility, act for the sake of one practical identity, and this choice or commitment is what lends the binding character to what is projected. The finitude of my commitment, my being a ground, possibilizes the givens of my natural, historical, cultural, social, and psychological condition, the circumstances, or Lage, over which I have no power, into a normatively structured situation involving grounds for which I am answerable, motivations that take the form of potentially justifying or normative reasons, Gründe, for what I do and say. Thus, as Heidegger puts it on the essence of ground, my being the addressee of the call to take over being a ground, grounding as establishing, entails a response that must account for itself. This is the third form of grounding, grounding as legitimation, Rechtgebung, logon didonai. This idea of legitimation provides the essential phenomenological link between reason giving and the care structure. As Heidegger describes it, legitimation is Ausweis, pointing out or demonstration, in which I propose, Anführung, a being that then makes itself known as a cause or as the motivational ground, motive, for an already manifest nexus of beings. Such an account can be done well or badly, but it is not optional. Rather, as taking over being a ground, ontological transcendence is essentially being answerable for reasons. The finitude of care entails that no matter how I go on in comporting myself for the sake of being something, I will be exposed necessarily to the question, why in this way and not some other? Because what it means to be whatever it is that I'm trying to be, teacher, father, or friend, is always at issue. My choice to go on in a certain way, that is, guided by my exemplar, Vorbild of teaching, is inseparable from the question of why I should go on in this way. And the general form of the answer to such a question is that it is or seems best that I do so, namely a reason why, my reason. This interpretation is confirmed on the essence of ground when Heidegger links the transcendence of Dasein to the good beyond being in Plato. It is not by accident, he says, that the agathon is indeterminate with respect to its content. Rather, what Plato situates in a hyperuranios topos is phenomenologically considered the ontological transcendence of Dasein, where what it means to go on in a certain way is always unsure of itself, at issue, finite. Dasein's sovereignty over itself as huhenika, for the sake of, is not a property, but a hexis toward what is best. And this orientation is the source of possibility as such. But since this sort of freedom is only in the choice of one possibility, choosing to go on in a certain way closes off other ways of going on, such that my legitimation, the recht of my reasons, itself remains at issue, essentially contestable. And because all comportment is worldly, and so involves being with others, My being responsible for reasons is equally being answerable to others for those very reasons. In this way, the threefold character of grounding in On the Essence of Ground demonstrates the normativity first character of Heidegger's account of reason. Phenomenological examination of how Dasein understands itself when all its ontic comportments have collapsed, namely its noetic grasp of what it is to be a self at all, shows that Dasein is an entity whose being has to take over being a ground in the threefold sense presented in On the Essence of Ground. All ontic comportment depends ontologically on finite freedom. Thus, taking over being a ground is fundamental comportment. So understood, freedom is pure sensible reason. My response to hearing the summons constitutive of my being as care brings reason as reason-giving in its train. If this is so, then we should now be in a position to answer the question left open in our earlier look at Heidegger's interpretation of Kant on the practical self and practical reason. To what extent do the essential elements of Kant's account of practical reason show up in Being and Time? If for Kant it is through the feeling of respect, our susceptibility to the law, that the law first becomes accessible to us, for Heidegger, it is through the affect of angst that we are made aware of a normative demand or summons constitutive of our being. But for Heidegger, this demand does not stem from reason, and so does not take the form of law. As a summons, it addresses me in the second person accusative. You must take over being the ground. Act for the sake of what you take to be best in what you are trying to be. Such acting is not subject to the test of a categorical imperative, because in committing myself to what I take to be best in whatever I'm trying to be, for instance, my exemplar or forebuild of what it means to be a teacher, that meaning remains at issue for me. The indeterminacy of the agathon is thus necessary. Freedom, self-determination, is not self-legislation, but comportment, in which the acting self gives to itself that for which the respect is respect, namely that meaning for which it is responsible in going on in a certain way. For Heidegger, as for Kant, the self's being responsible is the essence of the acting being itself, and indeed, it is practical reason. But for Heidegger, in contrast to Kant, practical reason is not limited to explicit deliberation, nor is it a monological assessment of the conformity of my maxim to the form of law. It is a dialogical practice of accounting for myself, being answerable to others in giving and asking for reasons. We might put it this way. The phenomenological elucidation of the acting self and practical reason found in Being and Time shows that care, letting things matter affectively in a certain way by binding myself to the normative demands of what I take to be the meaning of what I'm trying to be, is not governed in advance by a rule, but is the condition for any rule or law that can have normative force for me. Any such rule or law will be a function of how I, answerable to others, commit myself in response to the inescapable ontological demand that I take responsibility for the normative force of the norm at issue in my trying to be something. To a rationalist who embraces a reasons first account of normativity, this might seem to leave action guiding norms ungrounded, opening the door to decisionism and nihilism. But such a rationalist operates with a phenomenologically untenable concept of reason, one that presupposes the principle of sufficient reason, and so can safely be ignored. Retrieving the place of reason in Being and Time, then, depends on adopting a normativity first approach to reason. Norms are not normative because we have good reasons to adhere to them. There are no reasons until there is a being who must, that is commanded or summoned to, take over being a ground, answer for a particular way of going on. Responsibility is not measured by its accord with the law of reason. There can be a law of reason only because Dasein is a being whose life, being, does not bottom out in a struggle for sheer survival, but is always and already normatively at issue. That such an implication was left unsaid in Being and Time is of no significance. What is left unsaid can be said. That's the end of that talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I think now all of you perhaps have many questions or maybe some comments. So I'd like to just open this discussion session. Welcome you comments and questions, remarks, please. Will you please?
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your lecture.
I'm trying to I'm trying to increase my screen here so that I can see. I'm going to shut that down and see if I can get. I'm sorry about this. I'm still trying to get a full screen here.
If you stop sharing screen, yes, you come back.
Okay, here we go. Much better.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, will you please?
Okay, thank you for your very inspiring lecture. And I have a question about maybe in the section 3, when we're talking about the hammer. I think that this must be Heidegger's favorite example. When we drive a nail with a hammer, according to Heidegger, there is meaning in a practical circumstance, and this includes the pre-conceptual understanding of this practical circumstance, and this may presuppose that my self-understanding in this component and for the sake of some practical identity. But I'm confused about in this example that I choose to use a hammer, not something else, not a cup or something else, to do this work. Does that presuppose the minimum conceptual recognition or cognition of this situation? That I know that a hammer is useful in this situation. I'm confused about that. He said it is wholly conceptual or pre-knowing or something else. Maybe I'm familiar with Malabondi's discussion about something like this situation. He will analyze the relation between our action or our work and the perceptual situation. And he said that there is a expressive relation between them and or a symbolic form. In his early work, the structure of behavior, and I think his analysis might be more plausible.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. In one version of this paper, I had the term pre-conceptual, and in this version, I changed it to non-conceptual because I just want to distinguish, as I distinguished in the example, between conceptual recognition, where I can recognize a hammer according to marks of a concept. I may not know how to use it, but I can recognize hammers when I see one and so on, reliably pick them out. But in the case of the example I am that Heidegger is working with, the emphasis is sort of, it doesn't directly address the question of whether it's preconceptual, non-conceptual content as it is taken up in analytic philosophy. He's trying to get us to recognize that that what really carries the meaning is the skill with which I can use the hammer appropriately. And it's from that root level of skill and of engagement with things in the world that subsequent conceptual knowledge of what hammers are supposed to be gets derived. So I want to remain a little bit neutral because the notion of concept and intelligibility are close, but in this case, the hammer can show itself to me skillfully as a hammer, even if I can't give any account of what a hammer is in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, as I would need at least something like that if my awareness of the hammer were dependent on some sort of ability of mine to conceptually articulate it. When you say Merleau-Ponty has a more convincing account of this, where all I can say is when I teach Merleau-Ponty, I always stumble on the issue, which is really in a sense the same issue as you're raising for Heidegger, that it doesn't do much good to say that, well, in these experiences, there's a kind of admixture of the world and of concepts. You kind of lose the, well, let's put it this way. I've never found, at least in phenomenology perception, an adequate account of what concepts in their logical function actually are. And so I well understand what Merleau-Ponty wants to say, that there's this, in practice, in our engagement with the world, there's an embodied way that yields a sense or sens. But if you want, you can say, well, okay, one of the aspects of this is proto-conceptuality that is neither, just as the body, the lived body is not the physical Körper, so the conceptuality in sens sauvage is not logical conceptuality. But I think that's really, roughly speaking, what Heidegger is doing. I think Merleau-Ponty is somewhat dependent on this example of engaged coping, as Dreyfus calls it, to develop his own position. So I'm not objecting to Merleau-Ponty. I'm just saying that I think that there's not, on this issue, as much difference between him and Heidegger as is often thought. The main point for me in that passage is that in understanding that the meaning that both Merleau-Ponty, the meaning of things that both Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger are talking about in this analysis, phenomenology of practical engagement with the world, depends on my acting for the sake of something, on my trying to be something. So that meaning is only going to show up, whatever its structure, is only going to show up. The thing as it is only going to show up if I'm properly acting for the sake of, let's say, being a carpenter, or you know, the notes in a musical score are going to show up in their affordances, so to speak, only if I can play the piano. And so trying to play the piano properly is a kind of, or trying to build a house properly is going to be, or trying to do what carpenters do, is going to be the ultimate root of the meaning that that shows up in this pre-reflective engagement with the world. And I'm not sure whether Merleau-Ponty has that for the sake of element of this.
Yeah, may I just quickly jump in? I think this is exactly the point. Merleau-Ponty, no, Heidegger seems to be a little bit voluntaristic. So when he talk about this for the sake of, there's always a kind of self-determination, which never exists in Merleau-Ponty. That's why, you know, Merleau-Ponty stresses the living body, and the living body, the individual body is always intertwined with the other bodies. So when Merleau-Ponty talk about the symbolic structure with the youth object, with the cultural objects, at root, he stresses this is a relation to the other humans. Namely, when we have this youth object, we have this cultural objects, we actually have the kind of the embodiment of the actions of other human beings. So there's this the living body already somehow envelopes the other things. So he always say there's a kind of confusion between myself and others. It's not fusion, but rather confusion. So the role between us always, you know, reversible to each other. So in this sense, there's no this kind of very voluntaristic picture as it does in Heidegger.
Yeah, I realize that I'm not going to be able to really parse the difference between Merleau-Ponty. But the way you put it, I think in describing the phenomena, Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger are quite close. But in articulating the ontology that supports our everyday being in the world, our dealings with things in the world, they do differ quite a bit. And I'll just say, I mean, I find the Heideggerian analysis much more phenomenologically accurate, but of course, Heidegger never really deals with the problem of the body, and or just only sketches here and there, for instance, in the Zolikon seminars. But so he owes us some account of, and subsequent phenomenologists need to provide such an account. And Merleau-Ponty is one of those people who took up that challenge, both coming out of Husserl and also Heidegger. All I can say in this context, by way of expressing my reservation about Merleau-Ponty, his analysis, is that I follow Levinas's kind of categorizing Merleau-Ponty's position as a philosophy of participation, by which he means that though Merleau-Ponty makes what look to be conceptual distinctions that are supposed to overcome earlier ones, like, you know, distance, using the notion of intercorporeity or intercorporeality to overcome a kind of atomistic view of the social world and our relations with others, doesn't do justice to the differences between things. In other words, what Levinas means there is that difference is buried in a kind of oneness, or what Hegel would say, the night in which all cows are black. So Merleau-Ponty claims that he's preserving difference, but it's hard for me to see exactly how he does it. But that admit that I'm not a deep Merleau-Ponty scholar. This is the problem I encounter whenever I try to explain it to students. Whenever I try to explain exactly what the intercorporeality is, or the admixture of concept and thing in the sens sauvage, I begin to lose my grip on the root notions. Intercorporeity, I might say, doesn't do justice to the phenomenology of breakdown and that I think Heidegger is talking about. But this is a very inadequate sort of way of dealing with a big difference within phenomenology that tries to account for this root level of meaning. So maybe I can come back and say more if I think of a more pointed way of getting to it. But I've had these debates with Hubert Dreyfus also, who reads in his commentary on Being and Time, essentially imports Merleau-Ponty's account of the body into Heidegger's account of skilled coping, and Dreyfus's account of fast action, tennis playing, and that sort of thing, has much more in common with Merleau-Ponty than it often does with Heidegger. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Dr. Huang,
Thank you, Ken, Professor for the very rich and thought-provoking talk. I guess I'd just like to learn more about what you have to say about the relation between the authentic and the inauthentic. In particular, I want to learn more, hear more about the role of the inauthentic, namely the failure of responding, failure in one's response to the call of conscience, how that works in your account of this, well, normativity first theory of reason. Well, I don't know exactly how to explain or to frame my question, but let me try again to try to frame it in a comparison of your account as Korsgaard. Well, you say that the chronological elucidation of the phenomena, the experience of breakdown, shows that, well, taking the resolute taking up taking over of being around is a condition for any rule and law that can have normative force on me. Does this have the problematic consequence that if I fail in some way, erratically fail to take up being ground, then these rules and laws do not have normative force on me? For example, you see some people would find a parallel problem in Korsgaard's account based normativity on self-constitution. The problem would be that if someone fails to drastically in his or her efforts at constitution, for example, he or she acts more or less like a wanton in the sense of Herr Frankfurt, then it seems that the practical norms and even moral law no longer has a grip on her, because the normative is grounded on agency. If I'm no longer an agent, then normativity has no grip on me. So do you encounter a similar problem here? So just how does this possibility of error, possibility of failure works in your accounts?
Yes, thank you. That's a topic that I think is really fascinating and gets us into all kinds of what you might call moral psychology. If we see authenticity as transparently grasping the situation that I'm responsible for the normative, you might say, the normative force of the norms that in my commitment are embraced. Then in inauthenticity, I mean, that transparency, I think Heidegger goes in two different directions here, but let me put it this way. First of all, there is an attempt in inauthenticity to flee from the condition of radical responsibility for sustaining normative force that I have experienced in breakdown. The painful grasp of my responsibility for sustaining the normative world is a burden that I don't want to carry. And it is much easier to try to conceal myself from myself. So here we think of Sartre's notion of bad faith as a kind of self-deception, but it's only metastable. In other words, there's a sense in which my attempt to flee my ontological condition or responsibility is always, in a certain sense, unsuccessful. It doesn't achieve what it hopes to achieve. And so the question of whether the inauthentic person is not bound by norms, and this is something different than the question of the wanton, I think, but we can pursue that in more detail in a minute. But the inauthentic person does not deny the normativity of norms. What they deny is the responsibility, their own responsibility for maintaining the normative force of the norms according to which they act. They act toward such norms as though they were causes of their behavior. And so essentially on Heidegger's account, the inauthentic person is one who wants to be reabsorbed into the anonymous way in which norms usually function in our lives. And that is to say, as things whose normative force is simply there. It has nothing to do with me. And so I, as Heidegger puts it, act as one acts. I flee back into the ordinary and everyday way in which teachers are supposed to behave, so to speak. I attempt to relieve myself from the responsibility of supporting the normative force of those norms. And instead, it's not as though they have no force on me. Of course they do. I mean, I act as one acts. I'm craven in that sense. I don't go out of line. I do everything that teachers are supposed to do around here. And this is in effect to act as though that normative force was a causal force on me, but it isn't. I'm just trying to relieve myself of the responsibility that I discover when all of my practical identities break down. Now, of course, this could lead someone who had and retained the insight into the nature of the self as having to take over being a ground. That is, someone who knew that they were responsible for the normative force of the norms in accord with which they act, that person could choose to act as a wanton, or as some people think, well, I'll leave Nietzsche out of this, but they could just act in accord with whatever they felt like doing. The norms in accord with which they act would be unpredictable in that way. And the normative, but in each case of action, they would be taking on the normative force of that norm in which they were acting. For instance, I mean, Kierkegaard's Don Juan, right, or some big seducer. That person feels the normative force of how a seducer should act, and can also acknowledge that he is the one who is supporting those, maintaining that normative force in his behavior. But when that behavior changed, he's going to be maintaining the normative force of some other norm. And so a wanton in that respect is just one that recognizes the groundlessness ultimately of our self-identity, our practical identities. I'm not sure that quite gets at what you were interested in, but the point about the inauthentic is that the inauthentic person does feel the normative force of some norms in accord with which they act, but they are trying to, the inauthenticity is that they take themselves out of the picture and act as though those norms were not revisable, or their force was like a force of nature, like a cause.
Yeah. Okay. I actually have a couple of questions, because I'm very sympathetic with your approach to this normativity first account of reason. I think this is a wonderful point. But here, the first question concerns the relation, once again, between Heidegger and Kant. If we understand Kant's notion of, last time we talked about autonomy, but this time we can move back to imperative. It really depends on how we interpret the Kantian notion of imperative. There's I think the two mainstream of interpretation with respect to this Kantian quite ambiguous notion of imperative. On the one hand, there's a Hegelian one, namely the formalism. So the Hegel would criticize the categorical imperative as kind of the emptiness. Last time you mentioned, and the other one of interpretation, namely coming from the Anglo-American tradition in the 1960s, namely a kind of universalization of the maxiom. This is also what you have acknowledged last time, and this time you mentioned again. But the problem is whether this is really a good way, either of them can do justice to the Kantian notion of imperative. At least we can understand Kant try to make a qualitative differentiation between the Willkür and will, namely, while using a kind of Hobbesian terminology. One is a state of nature, the other is a state of a kind of the artificial state, namely the civil state. So in this sense, it's quite unclear for Kant whether we could really raise ourselves from this state of nature on the basis of this on the basis of the universalization of maxim to the state of the civilian, namely the Bürger in the Republic. So I think here, if we insist on this qualitative differentiation between the counting notion of maxim and also gazettes, the law, and then we definitely have the same direction as what you try to explicate in the Heideggerian case, namely the reason why counts as the freedom of the practical reason is a ratio essendi, and the moral law, the law rather than the universalization of maxim is the ratio cognoscendi. So in this sense, for Kant, already this kind of the normative first approach is there at stake in Kant, just like what Heidegger tried to do. So how to understand the freedom of reason? Then we have the norm, the normativity, namely the law. So I think here the first question is whether Heidegger so much differs from Kant, or maybe he just just another version, phenomenological version of quasi-Kantian approach to the concept of the practical reason. So this is the first question. Maybe then we can follow. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is another wonderful point that gets very deep very quickly. I guess I want to say that I agree with in a way the last point. Maybe there's a way of reading Kant if we start with the critique of practical reason as offering something like a normativity first approach, because the law of practical reason is supposed to be is supposed to direct the will. So it has that dimension of normativity built into it. Now, I know there's a lot of different discussions of how to unpack Kant's notion of an imperative and what practical reason. I mean, what practical reason involves. As he said, I mean, the divine will needs no imperatives, right? Only a finite will needs imperatives, and so I admit that that practical reason as a demand, right, has this normativity first character. The problem is it's not clear what practical reason is or demands, if you want to put it that way. And I think that that's the point where the formalism charge comes in, that it's almost as though you could say, yeah, the commander or the demander is normative, but where does reason come in? Why is it called reason? And that's where Kant says, well, he's thinking in terms of laws, in terms of the necessary connection, the universal and necessary connection between antecedent and consequent. But I don't see anything normative in that structure. So I think if one were wanting to say that reason yields practical norms, then you've already abandoned the normativity first approach. Unless another account of reason besides this logical one can be provided. And my point, I guess, about the formalist, what I like about the formalist critique is that it shows up what I take to be a limit of appealing to reason, pure reason, as providing concrete laws or imperatives about what we are supposed to do, what we must do. I'm drawn more in my discussions of the exemplar or the Vorbild, according to which I orient myself in the world in trying to be a teacher or something like this, is that it is indeterminate and that it nevertheless has a certain kind of claim on us. And the example, the way I think about that is the way Kant thinks about the kind of in the critique of judgment, when he talks about aesthetic judgment, that when I make a judgment of beauty, I can't reduce that to any law or determinate principle, universal principle. And yet I affirm, in making a judgment that this is beautiful, I affirm that others ought to see it that way, right? Others, the problem, and so he puts it this way, it's like we're in the presence of a rule that we cannot state. And I think that captures it. I mean, I think this is how I act in accord with how I think it's best that I go on. And this isn't pure inclination because it's normatively guided. I think it's best that I go on that way. I'm drawn by a meaning of what it is to be a good carpenter or a good teacher or what have you, good father. But it's in principle not possible to spell out a rule that captures what that is, because such judgments are always made, and this goes back to the third critique as well, on the basis of an indexical situation. What I mean by indexical is that the aesthetic judgment of a work of art can only be made in the presence of that work of art, this one unique work of art, according to Kant. And so that's the indexical moment. And I think the same holds for normativity in its root, that it's in this particular moment that I have to judge or assess this indexical situation and see it in light of how I think it best to go on. And so I think that that for my purposes, the critique of judgment is where I would look to see Kant as advocating something like a normativity first account of my, in this case, judgment of beauty. And so in a way, I want to import that, and I think Heidegger does, in fact, import that and into the general ontology of acting for the sake of something. And Hannah Arendt, of course, imports that into a political, her political philosophy. So, but beyond that, yes, the point is for a debate between Kant and Heidegger. The point is how to understand imperatives, and I'm a much more Kantian Heideggerian than most people are. Certainly Dreyfus and almost everyone thinks that Heidegger is nothing but Aristotle, and Kant is a detour or an Irrweg, kind of in his thinking. But I think that that focusing on the third critique gets us closer to the essence of Heidegger's Kantianism than even the second critique. But I'll admit, I mean, the way Heidegger translates, so to speak, Kant's notion of respect, and in the second critique is very suggestive in terms of a normativity first account, because when he says that respect is not our access to the law, but our susceptibility to it, I think this in other words, respect doesn't arise because we grasp the law, but we grasp and are able to recognize the law as a law because we have this affective openness to the normative. I think that gets something right about Kant, and also is very important for Heidegger himself.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to stress this Kantian dimension in Heideggerian works. I just like to push this interpretation to the extreme. I don't think we need to make a detour to the third critique. Even in the second critique, you can find this the hints. So you prefer this formalist criticism or account of Kant's notion of imperative. But the problem is, if we understand correctly this Kantian notion of imperative, it does have certain concrete contents. Because if we stress the imperative as a way like the Jean-Jacques Rousseau's, the volonté générale, and then we have the kind of, the framework to retain the Bürgerschaft of each of us. So that's why in Kant's, practical work, he always stressed the two examples: don't kill, don't lie. Why? Because that is a way to destroy this Bürgerschaft. That is a kind of community within which each of us is free. At the same time, we must live together with the others, not rather, we destroy the others. So it's very different from the universalization of maxim as, as in the state of nature, what people would understand of this imperative. So for Kant, at least I understand, so far as I understand Kant, the Willkür at best is we can have a compatibility on the basis of the inclinations, on the basis of the, our desires, and with a kind of the universalization of my own, desire and inclination, incompatible with the other individuals. But the will is something else. That's why, as you said, where is the reason? The reason comes from this, this obligatory and really the absolute standpoint. So here, this is also another interpretation problem with Heidegger, and as you suggest, Heidegger stresses in the second critique the Achtung, the respect. But the problem is in German, Achtung is not just the respect. Achtung is something like when train comes to the station, and then this noise with the Achtung, Achtung, right? So it's a kind of warning. It's not just the respect. It's coming from the above. So I think here, the imperative is not that empty. It's somehow concrete. But I do agree with you. Whether it is concrete enough, to help us to deal with, our, concrete environment, I think our daily life. I'm not sure, maybe this is a kind of thing which we can debate in Kant. But for Heidegger, I mean, especially when you try to bring in the Platonic tradition, especially agathon, I think this might somehow harm this normativity approach. Because on the one hand, Plato and Kant have the same kind of qualitative differentiation between the state of nature and also the Bürgerschaft or the staatliche stand. But the problem is, for Plato, if you stress the agathon, that is kind of objective insight. But for the normative approach, we don't need that at all. This is, I think, what Kant changes, even though somehow follows a Platonic idea, but on the other hand, differs from Plato's tradition, because that is entirely from the law. For that objective insight in Platonic tradition, that really demands a kind of intellectual efforts, which is, is not suitable for every human beings. But for Kant, the morality, the practical reason is in every one of us. So we don't need to have this kind of intellectual privilege to make access to this agathon. But your interpretation is quite, kind of compromising between these two lines. You say this is a forebuilt, it's indeterminate. But I'm wondering whether that is still a kind of Platonic tradition or not. Probably it's not. It's not Platonic, right? So here I just like to understand more what you think about this Platonic, the elements brought into Heideggerian Kantianism.
Yeah, that's I'll try to address both parts of that comment, which I find extremely rich and suggestive. First, I really liked the reminder that Achtung is actually a command, right? I mean, pay attention or take care, or and so that fits nicely with its other meaning of respect, and so this has a nice second person structure. There's a command and response in the same way. Whether Achtung by itself as command or pay attention is enough depends on what the circumstance is where the sign is given. In a train station, it's fairly clear. And then I think you were saying that we have a similar situation in civil society. Our natural, that the norms of civil society are something like take care, or right, be aware of, let's say, the fragility of these normative structures that we have. If that's what if one can derive that from the Kantian deontological approach, I'm very sympathetic to that idea, and I would like to hear more about it. I don't think I think I would want, just from philological reasons, if I'm interpreting Heidegger, I would want to translate that into what he is calling the content of the call of conscience, which, insofar as he's saying it's guilty, that is to say, you're responsible, this could be interpreted as a response to a warning, right? Take care, or Achtung. Yeah, and but that's, I haven't, this is new to me, so I'm grateful for your suggestion, and I'll have to think about that further as a kind of already a normativity first moment in Kant. And that would require a great deal of rethinking and reinterpreting what he says about law and about reason. On the other point, I agree with you. My appeal to Plato's good beyond being by no means is meant to suggest that either Heidegger or I am a Platonist in that usual sense. That is to say, my interpretation of that metaphor of the sun, if you want, is not that we have an intellectual intuition or some intellectual pathway by using reason to grasp this the content of the good, or this idea of the good beyond being. I kind of tend to work in the other direction. I mean, whether Plato or thought that philosophy was an attempt to specify some content of the idea of the good, I have no opinion on that point. But the only reason and I think Heidegger goes back to that idea is that I, at least, am thinking of the passage in the Crito, right? I think it's in the Crito, where Socrates is asked, well, he's giving an example of what a reason is, right? So his interlocutor asks him, well, Socrates, why don't you run away instead of sitting here in prison waiting to die? And he says, well, it's because I think it best that I be here rather than in Megara, or by running away. And he says, this is what reason is. You're giving an answer that I think it best is what a reason is. And that's what I'm calling justifying reasons or normative reasons. In contrast, he says, somebody says, well, what about saying, well, my bones and sinews are in this particular order and are sitting on this table right now. Is that an explanation for why I'm sitting here rather than running away? He says, no, that doesn't explain anything. It just gives prior conditions. And if I didn't think it was best that I should stay here, then my bones and sinews would be running away right now to Megara. So that's what a law is. That is a law of nature. But the moral order isn't law-like in that way. It's and quite apart from any supposed intellectualism. Socrates just says it's because I think it's best, and that's the form of any normative reason. Now, other things can be said. A person can say, well, why do you think it's best? And he'll say, well, I have, ties of affection, with family, and I have responsibilities to the city. And so he can give other reasons. But if this is what I mean by saying that sort of reason giving, which I claim is entailed by Heidegger's position, that we have, as it were, an obligation to do that. But that kind of reason is not supported by any even hint that there is a sufficient reason, right? That I mean, reasons of that sort give out. And this is sort of a Wittgenstein point. If I say, look, I mean, you believe that the Earth is, 300 years old, and I can give you all of these reasons why it's not, but ultimately I can't, as it were, prove that. There's no sufficient reason for believing that. And so my point is that I'm only interested in the obligation we have to give reasons in the sense of offering to the other some account of some fleshing out of the idea of a reason as why it is best why I think it best that I do what I do. So I'm trying to straddle the fence between an imperative notion of normativity and a whatever the other one is. I mean, the more I know there's a technical term for this, deontological versus something else, but I mean, an appeal to the kind of norm that shows up in orientation toward the good in Plato. Trying to combine the best of both of those pictures and read Heidegger in that way.
Yeah, but my question is, why not simply say, okay, look, this norm, the ground of this normativity of norms, it just can be found in the self-consciousness or self-relation of Dasein. Would this be more easier than just bringing in this Platonic tradition, say this agathon or Vorbild?
Well, I think that
I mean, I just suggest a kind of Fichtean approach, because you also mentioned
Fichtean approach. Yeah.
Yeah,
well, this is
a Fichtean approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we'll say a little bit more about that, I think, in the next lecture when I talk a little bit more about the structure of conscience. But yes, I understand. And Heidegger was very close, obviously, to the Southwest school of neo-Kantianism and deeply influenced by Fichte in that regard. And I think there is this notion of the call of conscience and the Aufruf is quite close to the Fichtean Aufforderung. The only question is, what do we mean by self-consciousness, right? And I'm trying to, in explicating Heidegger's notion of breakdown, I'm trying to show the complexity of the concept of self-consciousness. I'm not trying to deny it. I'm trying to say, yes, he has an account of self-consciousness, but it is one that is structured by what I was calling facticity and transcendence. It's neither a pure thought only, a Kantian transcendental unity of apperception, which we don't experience anywhere, right? It's just a thought. It's a condition that we have to assume. I've never been, frankly, able to quite understand Fichte's derivation of the I in his Wissenschaftslehre, but what I'll argue is, in effect, that self-consciousness is not a simple identity, I equals I. And it is a structure in which the I is always, the ego, as it were, is always second in, that is to say, it's always in response to a command that doesn't come from itself, even though Heidegger says it does, and I'll have to try to finesse that. I think he's wrong when he identifies the caller of the call of conscience with Dasein itself. So I guess the only difference I would say is that the way of responding to a norm authentically involves taking up my factic grounds as potentially justifying reasons, which means that I'm taking up those grounds as my motives and inclinations as under the guise of the good, that is, in terms of what I think, how it's best to go on. And that just strikes me as a Platonic moment that's just, well, certainly not eliminable from Heidegger, because Heidegger, he himself quotes it and, you know, assigns it to himself. But whether it's phenomenologically accurate or not, because Heidegger is not always an accurate phenomenologist, I would, at this point, I would be willing to defend that it belongs there and is not an importation, because without it, I don't know what you base your actual concrete commitment and decision on. I might be called, you know, and there might be a demand put on me, but if there is, I mean, I will be embracing it and recognizing its moral worth because I'm holding it up to a measure of the good, I would say.
Yeah, great, thank you. I see two signs in our chat room. Let's see whether some audience online have raised any questions. No, now we could invite our audience online. Whether you have questions, you can raise your hand or put into the chat room. We can wait for a minute. Oh yeah, Andy Du, please.
Hi, hello, Dr. Crow. Thanks for the presentation. I know we're a bit running out of time, so sorry for taking a little longer.
No.
My question is concerning, could you just briefly compare Heidegger with Husserl in terms of the normative structure of reason?
Yes. Yes. I think Husserl is an advocate of a reasons first account of normativity. And Heidegger revises him on that score. I think that Husserl has an intellectualistic account, roughly speaking, of what makes a norm a norm. And so he tries to develop a phenomenology in which genuine norms, well, he starts with values. So values are the validity of a value is grounded in what a certain thing is and what it like a hammer is a good hammer because it fulfills the function of a hammer. And then from there, he derives practical norms about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And also thinks that those norms and values can be objectified and determined in principle precisely through what he calls axiology, or the science of values, and praxeology, or the science of practices. So he thinks this is really sort of a truncating a very interesting and complicated phenomenology that Husserl offers. But he basically thinks he's, for most of his life and most of the time, he is a strong rationalist that thinks there is a sufficient reason for why we judge some things as good and why we ought to do some things and ought not to do others. And you know, he thinks that with more and better phenomenological analyses, we can actually determine an axiological and praxeological formal logic of values. Now, that's one side of his thinking, but there's another side to it where he admits that, can't remember the technical term for it right now, but he admits that there are values and action guiding experiences whose normativity holds only for one single person. That is to say, that he sometimes calls these vocational goods. So it might be the case that for a certain person, being a mother is of overwhelming importance to her, and that the claims of motherhood what would you call it? They trump. I'm sorry, I don't want to use that word, but they trump the universal claims of what everyone ought to do, or even what most mothers ought to do, or what mothers ought to do. It's an absolute imperative that holds only of one person, this vocational good. It's of overwhelming importance to that person. So this is a whole other level of values, these vocational goods, that stand quite in contrast to the idea that ultimately there is a universal science of obligations and values. Heidegger, I think, is under no circumstances thinks that there's going to be a formal axiology or formal praxeology, even though there's a formal logic that governs scientific reasoning, and Heidegger would agree with that. He doesn't think that those things are that the realm of the good and the obligatory are formalizable. So he, I think, would be very comfortable with Husserl's notion of vocational goods, or values and obligations that one personally took to be of ultimate importance. The only caveat, at least on my reading of Heidegger, is that anyone who appealed to the normative force of one of these personal vocational goods would be obliged, obligated in a Kantian sort of way, right? Universally, that it would be obliged to give reasons to others about why you're acting that way. You'd have to, you can't, for Heidegger, it's inauthentic, as it were, to shut yourself off from others. There's an obligation to share your reasons with other people. And so I guess that's not in Husserl, and it is runs counter to the idea that someone can simply shut themselves off to others and say, well, this is my vocational good, I'm going to do it no matter what you think. Because the normativity is something that belongs to the world that we share with others. Did that help? Did that help at all?
Yes, thank you. I think you were trying to say that for Husserl, it's more like a solipsistic approach, that the normativity is only kept into one person, at least some of the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, Husserl is a methodological solipsist, yeah, but in this case, the whole appeal, most of Husserl's writings presupposes that a logic of values and a logic of practical obligations can be developed. And to say that a logic can be developed, to say that these things are grounded in reason, is to say that it's not solipsistic. It's quite the contrary. It holds of everyone, and it doesn't just, it is not generated by my own personal experience. But that's the majority of his writings on ethics. But the late stuff does admit, I think, because he's an honest thinker, that there are these tough cases where you know, the family, let's say this child is so important to the mother, or, you know, some vocation, a calling. He's using Fichte's language there too. There is a calling that appeals to me alone. I wouldn't say that everybody has to prefer their children to all else, but to some people, that is like the content of their lives, so to speak. And Husserl came around toward the end to recognizing that there was something to this idea of a vocational good that has reasons for it, but they're not universalizable.
Okay, thank you. Can you just, sorry, just 1 minute. Can you just point out some of those late works? Because I have no idea what those are.
Yeah, I think they're in the lectures, the later lectures on ethics. They're not really in the published works. I mean, they're in the Husserliana series.
Okay, so only in German.
Yeah, in German. But if you want to read about that, you can read John Drummond's work. John Drummond has done some of the best work on Husserl's.
Yes, I read some of his works.
Yeah, well, he talks about vocational goods, or the other person is Ulrich Melle, and he wrote a paper that is in a volume edited by John Drummond called something like, what is it called? Something about phenomenological approaches to morals or moral philosophy. And you can read Ulrich Melle's paper in that collection, because it's in English and he talks about the importance of vocational goods for Husserl's last late period.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, because of time, we have to stop here. I'm very sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience in in listening.
We really enjoy your talk pretty much. Once again, let's thank Professor Stephen Crow for the wonderful talk today. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for listening and for your very astute and interesting interventions. And we'll be back next week if you want to hear more about Levinas and Darwin and second-person reasons. And I'm sure
Yes.
you'll have many objections to that too, and we'll try to clear them up.
Great. So we wish you a very pleasant weekend and welcome all of you back to our lecture series next week. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to it.